Tokyo, June 8, 1944. In a rented house near Higashi Matsubara, a 52-year-old lieutenant general sits down to a final breakfast with his family before leaving for an assignment he is not permitted to name. His wife Yashia has prepared herring wrapped in seaweed and rice steamed with red beans, not as a farewell ceremony, but simply because it is one of her husband's favorite meals. Under wartime security rules, she does not know where he is going. Neither do his children, 19-year-old Taro, 15-year-old Yoko, and 9-year-old Takako. The general offers a quiet remark before he leaves that this time even his remains might not make it home. His wife does not take the comment seriously. He looks too composed, too ordinary for a man walking into a battle he privately expects to lose. The officer's name is Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Within 9 months he will be dead, buried under the volcanic ash of a small Pacific island most Japanese civilians have never heard of. Within a year, the flag his enemies raise on that island's highest point will become the most reproduced photograph of the Second World War. And within decades, letters he wrote home during those 9 months, letters that were never meant for publication, let alone for the historical record, will surface and reveal something almost nobody expected. A Japanese general, writing home from the front, who understood before almost anyone else in his country's high command that the war was already lost, and who chose to fight anyway. This is the story of Iwo Jima, told through the man tasked with defending it, and through the paper trail he left behind that quietly contradicted everything his own government was telling the Japanese public. By the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Japan. American forces had shattered the Japanese defensive perimeter at Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan. Each of these battles had followed a similar Japanese doctrine: hold the beaches, and if the beaches fell, mount a final all-out banzai charge, a mass infantry assault intended to inflict maximum casualties before annihilation. At Saipan in the summer of 1944, this doctrine produced enormous Japanese losses in exchange for temporary and ultimately indecisive gains. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo needed a different outcome for whatever came next, because the geography of the war had reached a turning point that made the next battlefield unusually important. Iwo Jima is a volcanic island roughly 8 square miles in area, located about halfway between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 Superfortress bombers were newly based, and the Japanese home islands. The island possessed 2 operational airfields and space for a third, and Japanese fighters stationed there could intercept American bombers en route to Tokyo. In American hands, Iwo Jima would strip Japan of that early warning capability, provide fighter escort range for bomber raids on the home islands, and critically, offer an emergency landing strip for crippled B-29s returning from missions over Japan, potentially saving thousands of American aircrew who would otherwise be forced to ditch in the open ocean. For Imperial General Headquarters, the island was Japanese sovereign territory in a way that Pacific Island garrisons captured earlier in the war had not been. Its loss would mean American forces standing within bomber range of the Japanese mainland, on Japanese soil, for the first time. In April 1944, Kuribayashi was appointed commanding general of the 109th Infantry Division and given responsibility for the defense of the Ogasawara Islands, including Iwo Jima. He was not a first choice made lightly. Kuribayashi was a career cavalry officer, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy who had finished second in his class, and unusually for a Japanese officer of his generation, a man with direct extended experience of the United States. In 1928, as a young captain, he had been posted to North America for an educational tour, spending roughly 2 years traveling the United States and Canada, studying at Harvard University and attending the U.S. Army War College. Most Japanese officers of his era who studied abroad went to Germany, in keeping with the Imperial Army's institutional orientation toward the German military model. Kuribayashi's American posting made him an outlier, and it left him with a settled, unfashionable conviction, expressed privately to his wife and preserved in his letters, that the United States possessed an industrial capacity and a national energy that Japan must never underestimate, and that war with America was the one conflict Japan could least afford. That conviction did not make Kuribayashi a defeatist in the operational sense. It made him a realist about what kind of battle he was capable of fighting, and it shaped every decision he made after he stepped off the ship at Iwo Jima's Fujitsu landing point in June 1944. Kuribayashi's own military biography before Iwo Jima gives further context to the decision to place him in command there. Born on July 7, 1891, in Nagano Prefecture, he entered the Imperial Japanese Army as a cavalry officer and rose through a series of staff and command postings over more than 3 decades of service. In September 1941, he served as Chief of Staff of the South China Expeditionary Force and took part in the capture of Hong Kong that December. By June 1943, he had reached the position of commander of the 2nd Imperial Guards Division, based in Tokyo and responsible for the defense of the capital itself, a prestigious posting that placed him near the center of Japan's military establishment. He resigned that post in April 1944, taking responsibility for a subordinate's accidental fire, and was reassigned to Eastern Army Headquarters before receiving the Iwo Jima command 2 months later. The move from defending the imperial capital to defending a remote, unglamorous volcanic outpost was, in the context of Imperial Army career politics, widely understood as a step down, and some post-war accounts of his colleagues have suggested that his outspoken respect for American capability, unusual and unwelcome among his peers, may have factored into his reassignment to what many in Tokyo viewed as an expendable garrison. To understand what Kuribayashi did differently, it is necessary to understand what had already failed. Japanese defensive doctrine through most of the Pacific War rested on 2 related assumptions. First, that an amphibious landing force was most vulnerable at the moment it came ashore, so the defense should concentrate firepower at the waterline. Second, that once a position became untenable, a final concentrated assault, the Banzai Charge, was the honorable and tactically sound way to end the battle, inflicting a last surge of casualties on the enemy before the garrison was annihilated. Both assumptions had been tested and had failed to alter the war's trajectory. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders fought from beachfront fortifications and were largely destroyed within 4 days, at heavy cost to attacking Marines, but without meaningfully slowing the American advance. At Saipan in June and July 1944, a battle unfolding at the very moment Kuribayashi was assuming his own command, Japanese forces mounted one of the war's largest Banzai charges after their position collapsed, and American forces absorbed it at cost without their broader campaign being derailed. Garrison after garrison had proven that dying quickly and dramatically did not translate into strategic delay. It produced Japanese casualties, American casualties, and headlines, but it did not slow the American timetable toward the home islands in any way that mattered. Kuribayashi studied these battles as case studies in what not to repeat. He concluded that a beachfront defense exposed Japanese positions to the one weapon the United States possessed in overwhelming abundance and could bring to bear with total safety to itself: naval gunfire. Any fortification built above ground and within range of an offshore battleship could eventually be located and destroyed by sustained bombardment, regardless of how well it was constructed or how bravely it was held. And a Banzai charge, however psychologically satisfying, ended the battle in a single afternoon rather than prolonging it, precisely the opposite of what Tokyo now needed, since the entire strategic value of continued Japanese resistance lay in inflicting enough American casualties, over enough time, to weaken American political will to continue the war toward an invasion of Japan itself. This was the problem Kuribayashi had to solve: how to fight a battle in which naval and aerial bombardment could not be avoided, in which reinforcement and resupply from Japan were effectively impossible once the American fleet arrived, and in which the objective was not to win, but to make victory as slow and costly as possible for an enemy with essentially unlimited material. No existing Japanese defensive doctrine was built for that problem. Kuribayashi would have to build a new one, largely from scratch, using the 8 months he had before the Americans arrived. Kuribayashi's solution was to take his garrison underground, almost entirely, and to build a defense that depended on concealment and depth rather than firepower at the water's edge. This was not a metaphorical decision. It was a literal, large-scale engineering project, and it required a workforce and expertise Kuribayashi did not initially have on the island. He requested and received specialized personnel from Japan, fortification engineers and mining specialists, some with prior combat engineering experience in China and Manchuria, dispatched specifically to survey Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain and draw up plans for an underground defensive network. Iwo Jima's geology made this possible in a way it would not have been on many other islands. The volcanic rock and ash were relatively soft and quick to excavate, while still providing meaningful protection once tunnels were cut and reinforced. Kuribayashi diverted roughly 300 engineers who had been slated for deployment to Truk, secured several hundred more from other commands, and mobilized more than 1,000 naval construction personnel already present on the island. By the time construction was underway in earnest, engineers made up close to a tenth of his entire garrison, an extraordinary proportion of combat manpower to dedicate to digging, in an army that traditionally prized infantry numbers above almost everything else. The result, over roughly 8 months of round-the-clock excavation, was a fortified underground system that reputable post-war accounts place at somewhere between 11 and 18 miles of connected tunnels, with an ambitious and only partially completed design intended eventually to link installations across nearly the full 17-mile span the planners had originally proposed. Individual chambers ranged from small dugouts sized for 3 or 4 men to underground rooms capable of holding several hundred. The most heavily engineered positions, including Kuribayashi's own command post, were built as much as 70 feet below the surface, connected by a network of tunnels running dozens or hundreds of feet in length. One communications center alone contained an underground chamber roughly 50 meters long and 20 meters wide, reached by a tunnel driven 20 meters beneath the surface. Beneath Mount Suribachi, the island's dormant volcanic cone at the southern tip, engineers cut a network of tunnels described by post-war American surveyors as running through as many as 7 distinct levels. The design principles were consistent and deliberate. Entrances and exits were built at odd angles specifically so that a shell arriving on a flat trajectory could not strike directly into an opening. Most positions had multiple entrances and exits so that a single collapse or a single flamethrower attack at one opening would not trap or destroy the occupants. They could withdraw through another passage and continue fighting from elsewhere. Chambers were stocked in advance with food, water, and ammunition, on the assumption that supply lines from Japan would not survive an American naval blockade once the invasion began. Concrete and reinforcing iron were shipped in from Iwo Jima, roughly 150 miles away, in quantities sufficient to harden gun positions and command posts against direct hits. Surface artillery and machine gun positions were sited with overlapping, interlocking fields of fire, so that any single position knocked out by American forces would still leave the attackers exposed to fire from 2 or 3 others they could not see. Crucially, almost none of this was visible from the sea or from the air. American pre-invasion reconnaissance and the heaviest naval and aerial bombardment campaign of the Pacific War to that point, weeks of shelling and bombing runs intended to soften Japanese defenses before the landing, struck an island that, from any exterior vantage point, looked increasingly empty. Kuribayashi's men had gone to ground, and the bombardment that would have annihilated a conventional beachfront garrison was, in large part, striking rock and sand above empty tunnels. The defense was first tested, in full, on the morning of February 19, 1945, when United States Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions began landing on Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches at approximately 900 hours. The landing force encountered immediate physical difficulty. The beaches were composed of loose volcanic ash that swallowed boots and bogged down tracked vehicles, and steep sand terraces just above the waterline created violent surf that battered incoming landing craft. Marines and material compressed into the narrow beachhead, unable to move quickly inland. Kuribayashi had ordered his forces not to fire on the landing itself. Let the beachhead become crowded, let the Americans believe, in the relative quiet of the first hour, that the preliminary bombardment had suppressed Japanese resistance, and then opened fire with everything positioned to bear on that stretch of sand simultaneously. Artillery from ridgelines to the north, mortars pre-registered on the exact yardage of the landing zones, and machine guns firing from tunnel-linked positions that gave Marines caught in the open no visible source to return fire against. Casualty reports reaching the command ship USS El Dorado in those first hours were severe enough to alarm officers monitoring the operation from offshore. What followed was not the brief campaign American planners had anticipated. Iwo Jima had been projected before the landing as a battle expected to last on the order of days. It lasted 36 days, concluding only on March 26, 1945. On February 23, the 4th day of fighting, a Marine patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised a small American flag, an event witnessed and cheered by troops and ships below. Later that same day, a second, larger flag was raised in its place while the original was lowered. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal's photograph of that second raising would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize and become arguably the most reproduced image to emerge from the entire war. But Suribachi's capture 4 days in did not end the battle. It barely began the harder half of it. Kuribayashi had concentrated his most elaborate fortifications not around the mountain but across the island's northern plateau, and it was there, through positions with names American troops would later give them, the Meat Grinder, Bloody Gorge, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, that the fighting ground on for another 5 weeks. American commanders on the ground quickly recognized they were facing something unlike previous Pacific battles. One American lieutenant, describing the experience of fighting an enemy who fired from tunnel positions and then vanished, was recorded complaining that it felt like fighting something abstract and intangible, that his men would have been glad to fight the Japanese defenders if only they could see them. This was precisely the effect Kuribayashi had engineered, a battlefield in which American firepower and numerical superiority, ordinarily decisive, were blunted by an enemy who had made himself deliberately invisible. The scale of what Kuribayashi's underground system achieved is best measured in casualty figures that remain, to this day, unusual in the history of the Pacific War. Approximately 70,000 American Marines and Navy personnel took part in the Iwo Jima campaign against a Japanese garrison of roughly 18,000 to 21,000 men, the overwhelming majority of them not career soldiers but late-war conscripts, farmers, shopkeepers, and students with an average age over 30, called up in the final phase of Japan's manpower mobilization. By the time the island was declared secured, American forces had suffered nearly 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded, according to figures maintained by the National WWII Museum, with the Marine Corps' own historical accounting placing killed, died of wounds, and missing and presumed dead at 5,931 Marines, more than twice the number of Marines killed in the entirety of the First World War. Of the Japanese garrison, more than 21,000 were killed, with only 216 taken prisoner during the battle itself. A small number of holdouts continued resisting from the tunnel network for years afterward, with the last 2 Japanese soldiers on the island not surrendering until 1949, 4 years after the war's end. Iwo Jima holds a specific distinction in the history of the Pacific War. It is the only major battle of that theater in which American casualties, in total, exceeded Japanese casualties. That single fact is the clearest available measure of what Kuribayashi's underground doctrine accomplished, relative to the beachfront and Banzai model it replaced. Tarawa and Saipan had each produced heavy Japanese losses without materially slowing the American advance. Iwo Jima, using a fraction of the manpower advantage the Americans held elsewhere, produced a battle in which the defenders inflicted casualties at a rate the attacking force had not previously experienced anywhere in the Pacific. The tactical lessons of Iwo Jima were not lost on American planners, and their influence expanded almost immediately into the next and final large land campaign of the Pacific War. Okinawa, invaded in April 1945, barely a month after Iwo Jima was declared secure. Japanese commanders on Okinawa adopted a broadly similar approach: deep underground and cave-based defensive lines, avoidance of exposed beachfront positions, and a strategy oriented around inflicting maximum, prolonged casualties rather than winning outright, producing a battle that, in raw casualty numbers on both sides, dwarfed even Iwo Jima. American military planners assessing Okinawa's toll, layered on top of Iwo Jima's, arrived at projections for a full invasion of the Japanese home islands Operation Downfall that anticipated casualty figures in the hundreds of thousands for American forces alone. Those projections fed directly into the strategic calculus in Washington in the summer of 1945, at precisely the moment the atomic bomb became operationally available. The connection between Kuribayashi's underground doctrine at Iwo Jima and the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan is not a matter of speculation. It is a documented chain of strategic reasoning. Iwo Jima and Okinawa together demonstrated in concrete casualty figures what an invasion of the Japanese home islands, defended presumably along similar lines and on a vastly larger scale, would cost American forces. Military planners and civilian leadership in Washington used those 2 battles as the empirical basis for estimating the price of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. Those estimates, in turn, formed a central part of the argument for using atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, rather than proceeding with a conventional invasion. There is a further irony embedded in this outcome, one documented in post-war historical accounts of Kuribayashi's command. His successful defense of Iwo Jima, intended by Tokyo to weaken American resolve and slow the advance toward the home islands, instead helped produce the casualty projections that made the atomic bomb appear, to American decision-makers, as the option that would save the most lives on both sides by ending the war without a ground invasion. Kuribayashi had built the most effective defensive system fielded anywhere in the Pacific War, and its very effectiveness became part of the evidentiary record used to justify skipping the next battle in the sequence entirely. Beyond the strategic chain of consequence, Iwo Jima had immediate, tangible value for the United States war effort that had nothing to do with grand strategy. Once secured, the island's airfields were rapidly repaired and expanded, and Iwo Jima began functioning exactly as American planners had hoped, as an emergency landing strip for B-29 superfortresses returning from bombing raids over Japan, too damaged or too low on fuel to make it back to their Mariana Islands bases. Over the remaining months of the war, thousands of American aircrew who would otherwise have been forced to ditch an open ocean were able to land safely on Iwo Jima instead, a direct, quantifiable dividend from a battle that had cost the Marine Corps its bloodiest casualties of the war. None of this, the tunnels, the casualty arithmetic, the strategic aftershocks reaching all the way to Hiroshima, was known to Kuribayashi's wife and children in Tokyo while he was alive. What they had instead were his letters, a steady, censored, carefully worded correspondence sent home over the 9 months between his departure and his death, which survived the war and were later collected, translated, and published by the Japanese writer Kumiko Keikashi in a book titled, in its English translation, So Sad to Fall in Battle. What makes those letters historically significant is not their military content. Kuribayashi, as a serving general writing under wartime censorship, could not and did not describe tunnel specifications or troop dispositions to his family. What makes them significant is their tone, and what that tone reveals about a senior Japanese officer's private assessment of the war at a moment when Japan's public wartime propaganda was still describing imminent victory. Kuribayashi's letters home were domestic and specific. Instructions for repairing a drafty floorboard at the house in Higashi Matsubara, complete with diagrams. Requests that his wife not send him anything since supplies to the island were uncertain. Small, ordinary concerns of a husband and father, written from inside a defensive position he understood to be, in the long run, indefensible. Woven through that domestic detail, in language that occasionally slipped past Japanese wartime censors despite criticizing the war and his own superiors, was a man whose earlier conviction, formed during his years studying in the United States in the late 1920s, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity, had not changed. He had believed since his time at Harvard and the U.S. Army War College that the United States possessed an industrial potential he described as huge and fabulous, and a population he considered energetic and resourceful, and that underestimating American fighting ability would be a fatal miscalculation. Nothing in his experience commanding the defense of Iwo Jima gave him reason to revise that assessment. If anything, watching the scale of the naval and aerial bombardment directed at his island, a level of firepower no Japanese garrison anywhere in the Pacific had yet withstood, confirmed it. This is the core historical significance embedded in the video's title. Kuribayashi did not privately believe Iwo Jima could be held. He believed, based on years of direct observation of American industrial and military capacity, that the broader war was already lost in any strategic sense, and he built the most sophisticated defensive system of the Pacific War anyway, not to win, but to make the losses expensive and as slow as possible for the country he had come, through first-hand experience, to respect and fear as an adversary. His letters home, read alongside the tactical record of the battle he fought, present a rare documented case of a senior military commander whose private correspondence directly contradicted the official confidence of his own government, preserved not because he intended it as testimony, but because a family kept his letters, and because a writer decades later thought to collect them. The documentary record of Kuribayashi's final days is fragmentary, assembled from radio intercepts, survivor accounts, and the letters themselves, but the outline is established. As American forces cleared the island's northern defensive positions through March 1945, Kuribayashi's remaining garrison was compressed into an increasingly small area around Kitano Point, at the island's northern tip. He had been offered, at various points, the option of evacuation to a safer command. Documented accounts from survivors and family members indicate he refused it, choosing to remain with his remaining troops. On the night of March 23, 1945, Kuribayashi transmitted his final radio message to Japanese forces on Chichijima, roughly 150 miles to the north, a short, formal message bidding farewell to the officers and men there. The receiving officer on Chichijima spent the following 3 days attempting, without success, to re-establish contact with the island. Before dawn on March 26, several hundred of the last remaining Japanese defenders mounted a final assault against American positions near the airfields, catching sleeping Marine and Army Air Force's ground personnel by surprise and inflicting more than 100 American casualties before the attack was repelled. Later that same day, American commanders formally declared Iwo Jima secured. Kuribayashi's own death is recorded by American and Japanese sources as occurring on or around March 26, 1945, though the precise circumstances remain unconfirmed. Some accounts describe him leading a final assault from his tunnel positions, others describe a ritual suicide inside his underground command post near Kitano Point. His body was never recovered. He was 53 years old and had commanded the defense of Iwo Jima for barely 8 months from the day he stepped off the ship at Fudetsun. Kuribayashi's underground defensive doctrine outlived him by shaping how the remaining months of the Pacific War were fought and how the war's final chapter was decided in Washington, and it has continued to be studied since as a case study in asymmetric defensive warfare. A garrison a fraction the size of its attacker imposing, through engineering and concealment rather than numbers or firepower, a casualty ratio unmatched elsewhere in its theater of the war. Post-war American military analysis of Iwo Jima, and of Okinawa's similar underground defenses that followed it weeks later, became part of the doctrinal foundation for how the U.S. military thought about fortified cave-in tunnel defensive positions in subsequent conflicts, from Korea through Vietnam and beyond. In each case, we're learning some version of the lesson that firepower directed at an enemy who has made himself invisible produces diminishing returns. Kuribayashi's personal legacy took a different and slower path into public memory. For decades after the war, he remained, even in Japan, a relatively obscure figure, the losing general of a losing battle, in a country that had largely tried to move past the war's memory. That changed with the 2005 Japanese publication of Kumiko Kakashi's account of his letters, which became an unexpected bestseller, and with its English translation and its use as a direct source for Clint Eastwood's 2006 film Letters from Iwo Jima, which told the battle from the Japanese defender's perspective, a companion piece to Eastwood's Flags of Our Fathers, which told the same battle from the American side. Together, the book and the film introduced both Japanese and American audiences to a figure who fit neither national wartime narrative comfortably. Not a caricature of fanatical resistance, and not a simple villain, but a professional officer who had studied his enemy directly. Respected its capacity, doubted the war from a position of informed experience rather than cowardice, and fought regardless, with an engineering discipline that cost the United States Marine Corps its heaviest losses of the entire war. In 1985, 40 years after the battle, American and Japanese veterans who had fought on Iwo Jima met on the island itself in a joint reunion and memorial ceremony, an event that later historical accounts describe as producing a genuine, unforced sense of shared humanity between men who had once tried to kill one another across the same volcanic terrain. Iwo Jima today remains under Japanese administration, largely uninhabited except for a small Japanese self-defense force presence, its tunnels still intact beneath the surface, and it continues to be the site of periodic joint American-Japanese memorial visits. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, deserves its own place in this legacy, since it is the single image through which most people encounter Iwo Jima at all, often without any awareness of what was still to come beneath it. The small first flag, raised by a Marine patrol reaching the summit that morning, was witnessed and cheered by American troops and sailors watching from the beaches and the fleet below. It was replaced later the same day by a second, larger flag, while the original was carried down. 3 of the 6 men photographed raising that second flag, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, would be killed in the fighting that continued for another month before the island was secured. The photograph's fame has, if anything, obscured the battle's actual timeline in popular memory. Suribachi fell on the 4th day of a 36-day campaign, and the image commemorates a milestone reached barely a tenth of the way through the fighting Kuribayashi's underground positions to the north had yet to offer. The problem Kuribayashi faced in June 1944 was, on its surface, a narrow tactical one. How to defend an 8-square-mile volcanic island against an overwhelming American amphibious force, with no realistic prospect of resupply or reinforcement, using a garrison of conscripted farmers and shopkeepers against United States Marines backed by the largest naval bombardment force the Pacific War had yet assembled. His solution, an underground fortress of tunnels, camouflaged gun positions, and interlocking fields of fire, built by a workforce that made up a tenth of his own combat strength, produced a battle whose casualty arithmetic remains unique in the history of the Pacific theater, and whose downstream strategic consequences reached all the way to the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. But the deeper problem Kuribayashi was solving was never really tactical. It was the problem of fighting a war he privately believed, based on direct experience of the country he was fighting, could not be won, and doing so with enough professional discipline that his private assessment never once compromised the thoroughness of his defense. His letters home, never intended as historical testimony, preserved that contradiction in his own handwriting. Instructions for a drafty floorboard, requests that his wife send him nothing, and beneath the domestic detail, the settled judgment of a man who had studied at Harvard and traveled across America in the late 1920s and concluded correctly that his country had chosen an adversary it could not outlast. Iwo Jima did not change the outcome of the Second World War. Kuribayashi never expected it to. What his defense changed was the price of that outcome, for the Marines who fought there, for the air crews who later landed safely on runways built where his tunnels once ran beneath the surface, and for the historical record which retained in a general's private letters home a documented admission that the war was already lost, written by the one man tasked with making its final chapter as costly as possible. That is the story the tunnels of Iwo Jima and the letters of Tadamichi Kuribayashi still tell, 8 decades later.